reaching out to other people that were kind of going through the same thing we were. So that's how it all got started. Over the last few years, I've hosted a number of different kinds of meetings for parents just to have the opportunity to reach out to other parents that are also looking for information on dyslexia and how to help their kids, as well as providing other presenters that have been able to give great information on to help your kids within the school system and then also privately. So this evening, we have some great presenters with us from New Lenox, and we have Dr. Bruni, who will be speaking. We have Dr. Cucci, and then we also have Mrs. Takela as well, and she serves as a reading specialist in the district. So I'm going to actually give the floor to them. If you guys have any questions after they speak, I believe they have plenty of time for questions. If you have any questions that you'd like to seek me out for, I will be available. I also have some business cards on the back table that have my contact information as well. Okay? All right.
I will go ahead and get started. I apologize, we don't have a clicker. I am Marian Cucci. I'm the Director of Curriculum in New Lenox, and tonight we're here to talk to you a little bit about RTI. You might wonder what that is. That stands for Response to Intervention. So all general education students can benefit from RTI if there's a need for it. So let me give you a little background, and then we can talk about how students qualify for RTI. So RTI was a mandate that went into effect in 2005. In 2009, the Illinois State Board of Education said every school has to have an RTI plan, which all these schools in Illinois public schools did create a plan. This is in response to overcoming having obstacles to identify students for special education. Because back when I first started teaching, we had to show a discrepancy for students to qualify for special ed. Now, as a first-year teacher, I vividly remember a teacher saying, I was talking about a student that was struggling and sharing the things I was doing to help this child. And she goes, well, no, that child's probably going to go specialize with a learning disability, so you got to stop helping them because you need proof that they're not doing well. And that just seemed so counterintuitive as a teacher and even as a parent. I was like, why would I stop helping to show that they need help? They need help. I'm going to continue to help. So that's kind of where RTI came in as a law, saying, yes, in the general education classroom, absolutely you're going to help kids, but there's a process for doing it. And we're going to outline some of the things that have to be in that process. So that way, all students can benefit. And then if students are still struggling with all those supports in place, then you look to see if we might need to go to a domain for special education. So that's how that came about. Just click here. No, okay. So some of the things with RTI, there's some main tenets that are part of that. Isn't that going? There it is. So you need to have research-based programs. So you can't just have willy-nilly worksheets and whatever a teacher wants to do in the classroom. You have to have standardized curriculum. You have to have curriculum that's research-based, which in New Lenox we do. We spend a lot of time working with our teachers and finding our curriculum and making sure it's aligned to all the standards. With that, it also, we make sure that there's different levels of support in our programs that we purchase and use with all of our students so that they have layers of support, scaffolding support for all students. And then with RTI, some of the things that have to happen is you have to do continuous progress monitoring. So in other words, instead of just having a child that you're not helping and having proof of, oh, they couldn't do all these pages, you have progress monitoring. You give them interventions. You have different supports in place, and then you track their progress with different tools that are also research-based. So talking about those multiple tiers, general education students are typically in tier 1. That's the majority of your population. And then tier 2 are students that need some more support. And then tier 3 are your students that need the maximum amount of support. So the most amount of support are those tier 3 students. So tier 1 benefit from our research-based curriculum that we use across the district. Tier 2, there's different interventions that they may use. And tier 3 may use the same interventions as tier 2, but the frequency may be a little bit different based on their needs. And then another thing I'll just mention, it is involving all your stakeholders as well. So right from the get-go, if we screen students, because we also have, as part of the process, there's a universal screening. So you may have seen those Ames Web reports coming home for reading and math. That's our universal screening. That's a diagnostic test that just gives us a snapshot of how students are doing. But it's a research-based program that yields a lot of information for us to collect very quickly. It's very similar if you go to the doctor and you have your blood pressure taken or your temperature. It's a quick little assessment to see how are things going. If things look okay, then you move on. If things, maybe aren't so good, then maybe you need to do more diagnostic interventions. So one of the things that even the National Dyslexia Institute promotes is structural literacy for all students. This is actually straight from their work with Barbara Wilson. We actually benefited, Ms. Takella and I, from the conference last week. So this is something that they look for in literacy classrooms. And this is something that is part of our ReadyGen and My Perspectives program. So it is definitely a systematic program. It's explicit. There's a lot of direct instruction with how the students are taught with the program. And it is multisensory. We have lots of multisensory programs at the primary grades. They use Phonics. You have little ones, you probably see them doing actions with their letter sounds. And Haggerty, there's a lot of multisensory approaches. You may see them tapping out things. They might be doing airplane letters. So there's lots of things that they're doing in those classrooms. I already mentioned that universal screening tool, and then that comprehensive assessment. So we have the Ames Web. That is one thing we look at, and that's not the only thing though, because there are times that we piece together other things. We look at their classroom performance, because we know it's one snapshot, it's one little test. So how are they doing with their classroom performance? How are they doing with their sight words? How are they doing with their comprehension if you're asking them questions orally? So they might look at things such as their running records as well. And then we have that multi-tiered instructional plan. So in ReadyGen, My Perspectives, the teachers are great at implementing those different tiers. So they have scaffolded strategies that they use for all students. So if students need some acceleration, there's things that they can do for those students as well as students who need more support. And a lot of times it can be just questioning too. So there's, the teachers have their manuals, and there's a lot of great examples of questions in there that can force that student to take it a step further depending on whatever level they're at. So after we do our universal screening and we identify what students need support, then in the kindergarten and primary grades we have reading specialists that assist with delivering reading interventions. So I'll let Jen talk about those.
Hi, like you said, I'm Jen Takella. I'm the reading specialist at Spencer Point. So you see some familiar faces here. So in District 122, we have a lot of different interventions, and it's not just the reading specialists that deliver the intervention, it's also the classroom teachers. I'm not going to go over every single one of these, but some of the, I know, more popular ones in the building Ryan, we use Here Builders Lot, Haggerty, Wilson, I know kindergarten, let's see, Jolly Phonics, warm-ups, but there's different interventions for different things. So we have students who need help with their decoding. They might get a different intervention from a student who strictly needs comprehension work, or a student who is accurate but they need fluency work. So they might get a fluency comprehension or intervention, and some of them are a little more all-encompassing, where we just started using one, the Fontes and Pinnell LLI literacy intervention, and that's a little more all-encompassing. It's more of a guided reading, leveled reader with a lot of support around each lesson, which is around a book. So we also read Naturally Live, which some of you, that's a pretty popular one in our district too. But the takeaway is it's up to the teacher and the team to decide what the deficit is with the student, and then you pick an intervention to help with whatever the deficit is.
And the nice thing with the teachers doing this is that the teachers are able to give that instruction into those interventions in the classroom as well. So it's not like they're just getting pulled out and having that completed with the reading specialist. No, there's lots of kids that don't see the reading specialist, and the teachers are delivering those interventions. And that's grades K to 8. So we have students even at the junior high that are getting support from the teachers with different interventions.
And then these are just some of our math, these are all of our math interventions. student is struggling with something specific with math, if it's just, basic numbers, they might get one. If it's, something different, they might get another. And a lot of these have, like IXL is matched up to all kinds of skills to every level. So whatever the student is struggling with, there's an intervention they can practice with that.
And if you're taking notes, we do have a handout you can take with all the interventions listed, so
And we are always looking and researching different interventions. So if we find something or something that comes out and it seems like it may work for our students and it's research-based, we, double check the research on it, and if it's something we think is valuable, then we will use it. I know reflex math was one that we started using a few years ago. So, and that one's been highly successful for helping our kids with their fact fluency. So then, not only are we doing the interventions, we are also collecting the data. So we have lots of data, not just the Ames Web, it's that classroom performance, it's running records, it's our Terra Nova assessments, park data, students' grades, summative, formative assessment. There's lots of pieces to this puzzle that we look at as a team. So part of the team is the teachers, the parents, sometimes it's the reading specialist or psychologist, depending on what the specific student's needs are at that time. So we look at all that data on a regular basis, and then we make decisions of, okay, maybe this student needs their intervention upped. They need to do it more times a week than we're currently doing it, or maybe more minutes. Or maybe it's time to change the intervention. Maybe the intervention isn't working so well with the student, so then let's move on and let's look at something else. Sometimes the student maybe is doing very well with fluency, so now they still need some help with decoding, so then we focus on that. So it just depends, and we don't want to throw too many different interventions at once, and that's part of the whole RTI process, is that you're trying to do it very systematically, and you're giving students that direct instruction, but you want to pick one thing and stick to it until the students get good at it, and then we can carry it over to a different setting. So after we collect all the data, I had mentioned that there were those two tiers that we look at servicing students in. So tier 1 is the general education students, tier 2 is the one that students may need some support, and then tier 3, they need more explicit instruction, and maybe they're not making as great gains as some of the other students in the other tiers. So that's when we use all that data, we look at it, and we decide, is there something else we need to do? Is this a student that might need special education services? So I'll turn it over to Dr.
So then it gets to special ed.
Yes.
I kind of want to go back to what Dr. Cucci was talking about, the discrepancy model. I was a special ed teacher, always in the special ed realm, and then very interested in school psychology. So I was trained as a school psychologist under that discrepancy model. And I remember my first year after, your internship, you're like, wow, I've got this new great job. I'm the gatekeeper of special ed. And I would tell you, in the first 3 months, most people in my building, especially the gen ed teachers, didn't like me. Not because I'm not nice, but because it was like, we have these kids who are struggling. They need special ed, and I would have to tell them, nah, their IQ's not high enough, I'm sorry. They don't get special ed. And then the teachers would say, well, what do we do with them? I don't know. So when this whole RTI came about, it was like, wow, that really makes sense legally, that you have to help all kids, regardless of what their IQ is, regardless of how they test. So it was really nice that when that came out, I was just starting my career as the school psych. It was like, wow, now people aren't gonna be looking at me like parents even, well, my kid is struggling, and we'd always have to say, well, they're not struggling enough, sorry. So I think things have shifted in a very good way to help all kids. But really, the RTI leads to looking at a specific learning disability. And a lot of the questions I get, I have a couple slides, I tried to recap what parents ask. And what I guess they don't understand about the differences between like a DSM-5 disability that a doctor or physician would give versus a school category. So IDEA is our big law that came out in 1975 that said all kids are entitled to a free, appropriate public education. So that's changed and morphed over the years, but it's that huge protection that comes with rights, responsibilities, all of those good things for kids who have disabilities. So really, they say there's a 3-pronged test, and if you've been to conferences, you've probably heard this before. And these are kind of the 3 bullet points. first they have to meet the criteria for one of the 14 disability categories, and they're listed there. I'm not gonna read through them all, but the specific learning disability is the one that's linked to the RTI process. What is a specific learning disability? According to the state, it's a little bit different than the DSM-5. So Illinois has criteria that says you have to check these boxes. They can't be blind or deaf. Students can't lack of appropriate instruction. So if they have not been given that tier 1 research-based curriculum, then they can't qualify because they haven't gotten the core instruction. Second thing, does it adversely affect the student's school performance? That's changed over the years because it used to be academics only. Now we're looking at academics or functional. So we have a lot of kiddos that they're fine academically. They can read, they can do math, but they can't function in school. So now these kids can get some service if it's functioning and not just academics. When I was trained, it was like, well, they can read and write and do math. They're not special ed students, and it's like, but they can't function in school, especially in a group environment. So that I believe is also another positive shift to help kids. And then the third prong is, do they require specially designed instruction? So I think that, especially for this group, is do they require that systematic, implicit instruction like a Wilson program? Or, I'm trying to think of another program, there are so many, but do they need that? Something different than that core. So those are the 3 prongs that we look at for eligibility for special ed services to kind of come from the tier 3 into special ed. They're eligible and then they receive an IEP. If they don't meet one of the 3, they would probably remain in tier 3 if they're still struggling. So I think that's kind of the reality of special ed versus gen ed tier 3 support. Here are the 7 areas, and this is another big one that we talk to parents a lot about. So under SLD in Illinois, you can qualify in all 7 areas, one of the 7 areas, doesn't matter. But we don't necessarily say, and that's where I was saying that DSM-5 versus IDEA characteristics, dyslexia is not on there. So I think when parents who have children who do have dyslexia, here dyslexia is not one of our categories, it's like, how could you not qualify them? They have a disability. But dyslexia would fall under and would impact basic reading skills, fluency, or comprehension. Sometimes all 3, sometimes one of them. So because the encoding, decoding, all of those things, those are basic reading skills. So really it falls within that subgroup, or dyslexia would be a subgroup of a basic reading skill, which typically then will impact their fluency, which typically then impacts reading comprehension. And we know readers, sometimes it impacts one or the other more. So if you have a student who is eligible for special ed, who has dyslexia, one of those boxes would be marked, if that makes any sense. And then obviously the math, calculation is more just your typical calculation or your problem solving, written expression, oral expression, and then listening comprehension. So those are the 7 areas.
Just an overview of the process.
Yeah.
We try to keep it short and simple for you. Our teachers have received a lot of training over the years on RTI. They are very comfortable delivering those interventions, and your child's teacher is always their biggest advocate, because trust me, they're always trying to do as much as they can to help their students in any way that they can. So.
Right. So I think as you guys, can come up with your questions, we'll pass around just the handout. It's just the slideshow. And then we have a handout that's on our website. It's our response to intervention process and then special ed process. So I'll just pass these around, take them, and then we could field questions and
I have a question.
kind of go from there.
When did you implement the universal screener for reading skills?
Oh my goodness, Ainsworth, we have been doing that many, many years. I know I was still teaching.
When I started.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. It was
the indicators for maybe a reading learning disability?
All the ones, those interventions on there.
The interventions, but are there
Oh,
other-
screeners, you mean?
Other assessments, like an indicator like a PAR or something like that?
Our universal screener is the AIMS.
Okay.
There are other ones if they go to the special ed, area, so if they are going to qualify. There's lots of informal screeners and things that maybe the reading specialists use or the teachers may use as part of the curriculum, but as far as universal, we just use the AIMS.
In terms of, you talked about the 7 different categories that a child could be placed under, especially just knowing my own son with his form of dyslexia, he was qualified for fluency, but I feel like fluency, and maybe this is more of a Board of Education than, like not our board, but I'm saying State Board of Education than you guys, but how do you break apart basic reading skills from fluency? Like how is fluency not just part of basic reading skills? Because if they're not fluent, it's usually because, at least in my son's case,
They don't have the basic
he doesn't have the
reading
phonemic
skills.
awareness, and he wasn't granted the basic reading skill. Nothing against anybody, but he wasn't granted the basic reading skill because they said there wasn't data for it. But yet, I felt like the fluency was the data.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious, how do you separate that? I didn't understand that one.
If I can speak just from when we're looking at kids for power reading, there are kids who meet that mark on fluency, and then you look at their accuracy, and they're like, they can read wrong really fast.
Right.
So on that chart, usually they're just making it, but they're making it. So we look at things like, you have to look at the accuracy, and that's where you're seeing a decoding problem, because I agree, it's usually.
No, he's not making it for. He's receiving services for fluency, but not for basic reading skills. And I don't understand how, if they're not able to meet the mark for fluency, I feel like they should
So
be
you're
looking
saying
at the basic reading skill then as well.
Fluency only intervention.
Yeah.
That would be something I would say you need to talk to his teacher about.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I just felt like they should be going together. I don't know. That was my only question.
I
Was
think it's a great question, and I'd say I have lots of different responses depending on.
Right.
And like I said, you guys work with.
audiences and who,
Right,
but
right.
I know you work with what you're given. I was just curious if you knew more about it. That's all.
absolutely, I mean, your basic reading skills will impact any reading. So they are 3 different categories, and I do think, yeah, it's a state mandate, here are the boxes you
Right.
check. But I would think that typically most kids who are not fluent readers are not able to decode.
Right.
Or struggling with decoding, which causes a fluency issue, which then typically causes a comprehension issue. If you can't read fast and as you're growing and the reading rate is growing, then you start to struggle in comprehension. So,
Right.
but we do see kids who only meet the comprehension piece.
Oh, I get
and they're
that.
fluent readers, and it's like, what's going on in your brain? I mean,
And sometimes we actually have kids that are very good with the decoding, but they don't know sight words at all. So they struggle with that, so that slows down their fluency. So sometimes that's where the specialists and teachers need to, take a look at that and figure out what are those things to work on that.
yeah, and I would say probably for you,
Yeah.
if you feel that, okay, it's this decoding, encoding that's causing the fluency issue, in an IEP, the goal is written to improve fluency. How do you go about doing that can be done many different ways.
Okay.
Right, so you don't have to just say, okay, all I'm gonna do is read naturally. We know read naturally is a great scientific-based intervention for fluency. But no matter how many times I reread a passage, I'm only gonna get a little bit more fluent, I'm not resolving. So I think that's really a discussion with your team to say, hey, can we try a different intervention?
Yes. Which is what we started this year. I was just curious with the breakdown how that came about. That's all.
Yeah, and that's the state.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of, even in the other disability areas where, you could have long discussions over, is that criteria really appropriate for an emotional disability? So.
Right.
Maladaption would disqualify.
Correct, if you have any maladaptive behaviors, you're out, sorry. So, yeah. Other questions? Anybody?
Right, so, my daughter's in 3rd grade.
Okay.
And we had her diagnosed, outside of school first. report, all of the things that the doctor told me was all, the resources were all for dyslexia. Now, I mean, right now her IP is for, other health impairment. So I don't really know, the principal told me that, don't change it because, she's getting the interventions she needs. But how, I guess this is two things, how would anybody know exactly the interventions she needs if it's for a different diagnosis?
Mhm.
And with this, what's the
DSM-5 is the.
DSM-5,
Mhm.
so that's that diagnosis, but I can't find any information on that, and all of it says it's dyslexia. And she has a reading teacher that she goes to in the mornings before school for an hour that's been helping her for a year and a half. So, and she is like, she's dyslexic. So I guess, who would tell me that if the doctors are saying, we don't give that diagnosis anymore, and then here we are with all these, things about dyslexia. So I guess, I don't know. Who would tell me that?
I don't know if there's an answer for that.
Okay.
I mean, so other health impairment is really a broad umbrella. So any type of health diagnosis can fit under other health impairment to get special ed
And that was
services.
my first, I knew something was wrong. We all have ADD. I got her diagnosed outside so that we could get her out.
Yeah.
But now it's kind of like, I need to kind of
Yeah.
hone it in, but
So,
what is the difference between those diagnoses that she has and the dyslexia portion? Anybody? No.
I'm just trying to wrap my head around this. So it sounds like she has an ADD diagnosis as well.
She does, yeah.
So could it be that the school was predominantly servicing the ADD? And that's why she's classified as her primary? And it doesn't sound like there's a second, I would go back and ask a lot more questions.
Yes,
But
I don't really know what to ask.
In the school setting, we look at that IDEA criteria, those 7
Sure.
categories, so we can't say dyslexia. The doctor can give you a DSM version and call it dyslexia. But from our standpoint, a child that has reading troubles and we're going to help them.
Right.
So granted, a student that may be diagnosed dyslexic may need more intensive, they may be those tier 3 kids, or they may move into special education, but a lot of the strategies are the same. So a lot of strategies that our reading specialists use and programs are the same that they use in special ed or, even in the classroom, but it's that degree. Because if you're looking at those reading skills, they need to look at that fluency, that comprehension, the phonological awareness, phonemic awareness to become good readers. So you need to have all those components in place, whether it's a student that's struggling, a little, or someone who's struggling a lot.
and the interventions can be the same.
Right,
Sure.
And I would say from the special ed department, we look at classification on how do we get the student service.
Right.
So a lot of times parents will say, well, is it this first or that first?
Doesn't matter.
As long as they're getting the instruction that they need and they're making progress. And I know as a parent, I'm a parent, it's like I wanna know what to call it.
Yeah.
Because then people know better how to treat it, typically. But,
From your standpoint, it's all.
as long as they're getting the intervention they need, the goals and objectives they need, and they're making progress.
Right.
Personally, I don't care what you call it. And I hope I don't offend anybody here, but it does not matter to me what you call it as long as they're making progress, they're getting what they need,
Is your daughter getting reading intervention for her dyslexia
Yes.
in school?
Yes, that is,
And
but
outside
that was
school?
kind of, I guess secondary thing. It's been a process, I just wanted to start somewhere, but yeah.
but she has a reading goal on her IEP.
Yes, which I don't understand, so,
Okay.
whatever.
Well, and two, just for anybody here, if you can always contact me, I'm happy to go. I love playing the psych role, even though I'm not anymore, but I love it. So, if you need help understanding that or just breaking down that goal to find out, is that really addressing her weakness?
Right.
Like that
That's
deficit?
kind of what I need to know.
Yeah.
It's working.
Yeah. I think some resolve for you. Yeah.
So I have a question that I typically hear from parents. So with IEPs, there's goals that can be measured in order to see growth over time or measure growth over time. And with RTIs, there's a continuous progress monitoring. But in a parent's mind, I think the question is how much growth is enough and how long should I not wait to pursue something more, or what am I looking for? Does that make any sense? Did I articulate that?
So my daughter has a 504 and it's immeasurable, it seems like. There's no way, we do get the progress monitoring, but we don't have goals.
So a 504 is totally different, no goals, objectives, really no instruction for the 504. A 504 is an accommodation plan for anybody with any disability. Allergies, I mean, you name it, almost any kid could have a 504, but it only provides accommodations for that classroom, for them to access their environment. So if your child has a 504 for some type of health condition, but then also struggles with reading, then they should be looking through the RTI process and also special education. Because the 504 will only give accommodations.
And she gets that from her classroom teacher.
Right. I think back to Anne Marie's question is how long is enough? And I know we're supposed to come here to answer questions and we can't answer any of them.
Individualized, that's the hard part.
It is.
Depends on the student.
It's really difficult because
So I guess, like, what should a parent look for? If,
I would say closing the gap.
right,
Closing the gap. Now,
so what does that mean?
it means looking at the student's profile, how long they've got the intervention, what intervention's being used, and that's kind of what Mrs. Takawa was saying, like there are so many different interventions, even in special ed, so we're trying one thing and we're not seeing the progress. Doesn't necessarily mean there's a learning disability there, let's try something else. So I think that's where that frustration comes in when you know something is not working. You know, they're struggling. I don't know if there's a timeline. I know there's a big myth in our district where teachers will say, well, I have to give it 8 weeks, and then after 8 weeks, they're in. There's never a cutoff, there's not a rule, I would say.
And the teachers and reading specialists for the Ames Web and their progress monitoring, they are setting goals. They're setting a rate of improvement goal. So you might notice that on the progress monitoring, it's an ROI, and you can see the kids. So you'll have like a target line, and then you can see where your child's performing based on that target. So they normally set the target at 25th percentile. Or it depends on the kids. Yeah, I was gonna say, it depends on the kids
Yeah,
too.
it really is, we wanna make growth, but we don't wanna be too ambitious, so
Yeah.
the way we said it, the Ames Web Plus is our new version of Ames, and they actually have a really helpful slider. Are you familiar with Ames? Yeah, where you can set, it'll say ambitious, which is probably a little more unattainable than a standard goal, and then if you set it too low, it'll say too low, this is too easy, this kid is gonna get this, so.
I like the user-friendly definition is closing the gap. So
Yes.
if you can look at scores and we're closing the gap, then we're seeing progress, we're seeing success within whatever program that's being
And
implemented.
I would look at multiple things, don't just
Right.
look at the aims, I mean, that's just one piece of it. Look at, other things that they're doing in the classroom, definitely have those conferences with, the teacher, parent-teacher conferences.
We look a
see how
lot
they're
at,
doing.
like, and just speaking for our building, we'll look if we have some Terranova scores,
Yeah.
we'll look at Ames Web, we'll look at running record, we'll talk to teachers, so it's not just one piece, we like to triangulate the data just to get a better picture of the student, which is hard sometimes when they're in first grade, because we don't have as much, but second and third, it's a little easier to do that.
So of your reading interventions that you have on this chart, which ones are specific for someone with specific reading learning disability? Like, or for dyslexia?
Well, for dyslexia, I would say, what I think is Wilson, anything that's,
Foundations,
explicit,
peer builders.
multisensory,
We're
direct
using
instruction.
foundations for kids who need to prepare to go into that multisensory reading intervention program, Wilson.
I think primarily the reading specialists at primary are using Wilson Foundations, and Wilson Foundations could be a tier 1. I mean, there's
Oh, just
classroom
in the
teachers.
general pop, okay.
We don't use it as a tier 1, the classroom teachers don't use it, but it can be used that way. We use it in a tier 2 setting. So classroom teachers don't do Wilson foundations because it's more of a curriculum and you have to see the kids pretty frequently. So most of the reading specialists do that. If a student gets diagnosed with a reading disability, dyslexia, typically, and I'll just speak for, in our building is usually they then continue on with that intervention, but they'll get more of it. And there's students in our district who get Wilson as well.
So do you have Wilson certified and Wilson trained reading specialists delivering that Wilson program? Or the people who are doing the Wilson intervention, are they Wilson certified? And are some of them just Wilson trained? What does that look like?
So they
Is it a
have a minimum of the
minimum?
3-day
Yeah.
Wilson
Yeah.
training. Some
Mhm.
people are little overachievers with Wilson and keep going on, but yeah, in the foundations, it's
And are they funded
a
for
2-day.
their continuing ed through your district? Do they pay to get, so if you finish, if you're certified to implement books 1 through 6 of Wilson, but then 7 and beyond, there's an extra fee to get certified. Do you leave that up to your teachers to do, or can they go and get help from the district to
Yeah,
continue?
I mean,
We pretty
yeah,
much
we have
support
a-
any professional
Yeah, we have
development.
professional development,
That's great.
set
And
up
do
for
you
the
have
teachers.
other, maybe modules that your teachers can tap into for professional development, for awareness about specifically on dyslexia? that
Yeah,
you do?
we've done NLUs for
Yeah.
teachers,
Uh-huh.
me and
And NLU is our teachers teaching other teachers. So it would be something like a trainer.
Yeah.
And then we offer it to everyone in the
And you
district.
have those programs specifically on dyslexia?
We have.
You do?
Mhm.
a group of us actually just, the district sent and paid for us to go to Everyone Reading Illinois conference. Hey.
That's great. Have you ever done a district-wide or school simulation on
We had
dyslexia?
it's Everyone Reads Illinois, they came in
Oh,
at
they
one of our
did.
institute days, and it was a
As an
session that,
institute day, okay.
yep, it was a session that
All day or
teachers
just
that
one?
could,
One
it was a
session?
session.
And
they
how
could
long ago
send.
did you do that?
It was last
Recently?
spring, last
April?
spring. Was it March?
And what was your teacher's response to that, your general, was everyone required to go to that, or?
No, not everyone was required. I think they found it beneficial. I mean, I think they enjoyed it. I think some felt validated with what they're doing is what they should be doing. So, I definitely think it's something that was worth doing for sure.
Would you do it again?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Our full day institute days typically are sessions that we offer, so we
Right.
never, typically we don't say this is what you're going to
Yeah,
be trained on all
We
day.
have over 300 teachers.
So we say, here are the sessions,
Right.
what's your interest? You pick 3 sessions of your interest, so it's not like we're gonna do an all day for all of the teachers of one thing.
Okay,
Yeah.
so that's a parallel to us. What's the size, the student, population of this school district?
5,300.
I was gonna
A
say
little over
56.
5,300.
Okay,
Yeah, so we have 12 buildings.
okay.
You had mentioned before that the reading specialists do the tier 2 interventions.
Well, not all, I mean,
It depends.
classroom teachers can also do tier 2.
Okay, but I am under the understanding 4th through 6th buildings do not have reading specialists anymore, is that true?
Correct.
Okay, is,
So teachers do the interventions in 4th through 6th grade, and the reading specialist at the campus does go over and give support to the teachers, kind of like a coaching model if needed. And their kids transitioning from like 3rd to 4th, the reading specialist talks to the teacher, says these are the interventions, they should continue. And
but
they
if
do
a
that
child
support.
isn't found to have a problem until like 4th, 5th grade, it's on the classroom teacher then to do?
Yeah,
for the
they
most
meet in
part?
teams though, I mean, they have their team meetings, they have their data days.
But I'm saying to implement the RTI, to be able to try to decide if they meet the criteria, they usually do RTI first, am I under that?
Correct.
Okay,
Correct, yep.
so, but to implement the RTI, then that's all falls under the classroom teacher?
Mhm.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, the principal was part of that process as well. It is still a team meeting.
Are there reading specialists in the junior highs?
There are 2 reading specialists in the junior high.
Okay, so 4th through 6 is the only ones?
Correct.
Okay.
Right.
Is there a reasoning behind that? I'm just curious, because
It happened
most
when-
people I know that get diagnosed with, especially like this kind of disorder, it's not till 4th grade, and that's where,
4th grade reading some, statistically. I wanna say
really, it
and
was
cuts,
a
so-
weighing of resources,
Yeah.
you know, and the feedback that we got from the principals and the teachers was that in 4th, 5th, and 6th grade, because they're more departmentalized, that the language arts teachers are teaching language arts and it's easier for them to provide an intervention versus like at a primary grade when you have all the kids all day long for every subject. The language arts teachers are a little bit more specialized. So, you know, it is what it is right now.
Yeah.
But I do think that if you do have a struggling 4th, 5th, or 6th grader, they will get that intervention. It might not be by a reading specialist, someone outside of their classroom, but it will be delivered. It should be in the same systematic way that it would be delivered if it was another person in there.
Oh, I understand that. I was just worried about the teachers,
Yeah.
to be honest, but
Yeah.
that just seemed like a lot.
Lots of professional development that they're trained up on.
Oh, I'm not worried that they're not trained. I'm saying it seems like there's quite a few kids. If there's quite a few kids in your classroom that are all looked at as possibly having something going on, that's a lot on the teacher to then progress monitor and do the RTI and the meetings and all of that stuff that was my only concern was the classroom teacher. My kids have had awesome teachers and I just was worried about them, that's all.
So, daughter's in 3rd, going in 4th, so she has an IEP, what happens next year?
She'd get the same services.
Okay.
So the IEP,
So you're talking about the RTI is.
RTI is different.
Okay, so these
Yep.
are, okay.
So
All right.
special ed, when
Yeah.
a student qualifies, they're eligible for 3 years. So I don't know when your daughter qualified, but it'll be 3 years, then they'll do a reevaluation where they reevaluate to see if they still qualify. Then every year you'll meet for the IEP, and that's where you would adjust goals,
Right.
especially under the OHI umbrella. You could add goals for different subject areas because it's that huge umbrella versus a specific learning disability is only for reading fluency.
Right.
So if the box is checked for reading fluency, we're just gonna monitor reading fluency. And then the tricky part is, so then all of a sudden they start having a math issue. We have to reevaluate them and they have to go through RTI for math, where your OHI, they don't have to reevaluate it. So it's kind of almost a better, broader umbrella than something very specific. But I guess it's how you look at it, but yeah.
Right, so that's 2 different things.
Yeah.
The RTI is.
Yeah.
Okay.
RTI is gen ed, and then special ed would be your IEP.
Right. But if you wanna talk, I heard we get this room till 7:45 on the dot. So when we break up, I could answer specific questions, you know, so you have other stuff tonight.
I had a question for you about the 7 categories there that qualify under the Illinois law. So if, it sounds like those are sort of symptomatic, and maybe I'm reading this or understanding this wrong, but say that, like, a diagnosis of dyslexia almost sounds like it's more of a medical condition, maybe I'm just misunderstanding the label, but that condition can manifest itself as with one or multiple of those symptoms, is that kind of a fair way of describing it? So if a child has a couple of those symptoms, how does, or would it be beneficial to have a diagnosis, or does that really factor into the interventions that would take place?
I would strongly, I tell parents, don't spend the money on a diagnosis unless it's something you want as a parent. And some people want that. The diagnosis gives us more information but our school sites do the same types of testing and can qualify for special ed.
So what would help you guys understand, or how do you guys decide which interventions are appropriate for a child?
I'd say probably first you start with teacher input, their current teacher, what are they struggling with and how are they reading? You know, and then they meet with the team and kind of
It's
describe.
pretty basic, like especially in primary, like 1st grade, kids that are coming in don't know their letters and sounds. That's usually the first indicator, and that's all kids. Your kids who are dyslexic, not dyslexic, that's usually your first indicator, and that's where the screener comes in handy because we check letter sounds, letter names. We have them read sight words, so that's our screener, and we start with that. Traditionally, I always would start all my 1st graders with foundations because I just think it's good for all kids to receive that type of systematic, explosive, direct instruction. And so in primary, it's pretty easy, and then you'll see some kids will take off with the coding and their reading and they're getting that, well then how to talk to their teacher, then comprehension's a problem, then you might switch to a comprehension type intervention. So younger, it's really not that difficult. I mean, the kids all look pretty similar. They separate as time goes on, and that's why sometimes, I hate to say the wait and see approach, but sometimes as reading specialists, I do wait and see, because I have seen kids struggle for a year and then have a 4 month, they have a great summer and whatever, and then they pop up. Some of it is just developmental, some of it is maturity. When you get a student who's in first grade and just turned 6, on August 29th versus that kid that's 7. So there's a lot of factors that we look at, but when it comes, when kids have a learning disability, traditionally they're not catching up as fast as we would like, and after, I don't wait 6 and 8 weeks, I could wait a year, I could wait 2 years as a reading specialist working with that child, so long as they're making progress. But after a while, if we're not filling that gap, that's when we might start discussing IEPs and meeting with the team and talking about things like that.
So if an outside diagnosis was done, would there be situations in which you guys still wouldn't want to do the IEP and just do the RTI? Or is it typically?
So, outside evaluations, totally another night. There's a lot to know about it, but I'd say in a nutshell, if a parent brings in any outside information from any doctor, if it's dyslexia, health impairment, whatever, I would definitely bring it to the school because it's information. But then the school then decides, do we do a case study? So really it's the parent, or anyone can refer a child for a special ed case study. So either it comes from the RTI team or sometimes from a parent. They bring in an outside eval and say, this is what my doctor said my child has and this is what they need. Then the school team looks at that information and then they determine, do we move forward with the case study? So a lot of times when they come in and they're young and they haven't gotten any intervention yet and they have an outside diagnosis, the team will sometimes say to the parents, let's give them some interventions and see how they do. We're not gonna test them right now because in the SLD criteria, we have to show that they have not responded to interventions. So that's, I guess, not the downside of RTI, but we no longer can say they're discrepant, they get an IEP. We have to say, what interventions have they gotten? So if you had an outside diagnosis, you bring it in, the team says, okay, let's consider this information. Child hasn't gotten any interventions yet. We're not gonna do a case study right now. We're gonna put interventions in place and then revisit this in 3 months to see, is your child responding? Because the other piece is, if they're responding to the reading intervention, I don't wanna pull them out for special ed and take them out of their least restrictive environment, because that's the flip side of special ed is kids are entitled to be in the least restrictive environment. So when we take them out of gen ed and put them in a special ed environment, we're not supposed to do that unless we have to, unless it's necessary. So that's where that RTI piece comes in. But I do know a lot of parents will come in with these outside evals and say, I have kind of like the golden ticket. I have this. And it's like, it's great information, but it's a lot of money if it's not covered under your insurance. And I always say, is that going, so it's up to the parent, but I always discourage an outside eval because I don't want parents spending their money when the public school district should be evaluating children appropriately. So I don't know if that helped or made it more confusing.
So then how would, if you don't have the outside diagnosis, but as a parent you have those concerns, then who do you go to say, I have these concerns, but I can't afford the outside diagnosis, what can I do?
Yeah. So I would go to your building, I would contact your school psychologist, because they're wonderful, but contact your school psychologist and I would say I have concerns about my child's reading, and ask for a meeting. And then they'd have their gen ed teacher there. They would, bring all the Ames web, look at their profile, and determine if they need an intervention, if they're below 25th percentile, where they're at, where they were last year, and just looking at all that curriculum-based typed assessment versus a neurological assessment. Because then the neurological assessment is going to give you a diagnosis, but it may not get you the intervention or the special ed or the RTI that you're looking for. So I would say, save your resources, come to the school and talk about your child's profile and what information that the school's collected on them. Yeah, absolutely.
After 2 quarters of progress monitoring and it doesn't seem to be doing anything, at what point you just say, hey, we need to reconvene and have another AR?
You can do that at any time, you know, I don't know, I probably wanna know more information about what what the progress looks like and what the slope and what that gap looks like. But I would say if you're concerned, you always can ask to have a meeting, and I think it's better to ask before you get to a frustrational point, you know, to say, hey, I'm still concerned.
Sure.
Can we get together and meet? Ask that team, you know, they know your child best as a learner in the school environment. But yeah, I never think there's any harm in meeting multiple times if you're concerned.
But couldn't he also make a formal written request of the school to,
Consider a case study.
consider case study
Absolutely.
for his child, if he
Yeah.
hasn't gone there already, so if the RTI isn't working, and you wanna go into that next area that they're talking about here, let's get those interventions that are under the special ed, in the special ed box. I mean, you have to sit down and go through, ask the psychologist to open up domains and
Right.
look at that instead of going outside and getting permission, something from a neuropsych. That's kind of what I'm hearing from the room, like people don't know.
Right, so you could ask for a case study at any time, but based on how long the intervention's been, the answer the team might say is, we need more time to give the intervention. So just because you request the case
I
study,
understand.
right, doesn't, but you can.
In our particular circumstances, he's already able to spend, so.
Oh, okay, yeah.
It's,
So if he has goals and objectives and you're feeling like, okay, I get my goal updates and the progress is not what I wanna see, I would ask your case manager, hey, let's have a meeting. I just, you know, it doesn't have to be a full-blown IEP, we're changing,
right.
but let's just talk about what's going on.
What kind of interventions are going on and maybe, you know,
What else can
switching
you-
gears a little bit.
Correct, what else do you guys have to offer?
Right.
You know, just like that, I think it would be helpful.
Yeah, I talk to my daughter's case manager, not all the time, but whenever I have a question, she responds the same day or the next day, usually in so much detail that it takes me a couple days to come, absorb it, but it's not the same as it was before the intervention was put in place. I've got the formal team meeting where 12 people are at the table. It's more of a one-on-one with the case manager, and they will ask you about assistive technology, or if there's something you're using at home or something, making it better for him or her.
How would you progress monitor for decoding? Like if you have a decoding goal, like I know the Ames Web is mainly fluency, right?
Well, no,
No,
there's
there's-
decoding.
Oh, there is
Yeah.
decoding.
There's
Oh.
an accuracy score, so that's your how many mistakes per you make, and then they give you, you should be, students should be reading at 90% or higher. Be 90% accurate or higher, 95% is even better, but a minimum of 90%. And you can see that right on their report, yeah.
The silent reading comprehension on the Ames Web is garbage though, because kid just clicks ahead. I say 85th percentile. Well, what do you mean, you just click that? So,
The teachers are usually pretty good about monitoring that, though. They really try to make sure the kids are doing their best and they're watching them. Because it comes to me if we need to delete a test and have a kid take it over, because they did that. The teachers are usually on it. And they know just based on their reading habits. And seeing
70%
the,
comprehension, but 85% over.
yeah, no, and then
It was
that's,
a good day,
that's what we
right?
do.
No,
That's
it's
I'm
torturous.
sorry, you gotta retake this test and I'm gonna watch it this time.
It's like when a kid takes like a Terra Nova and they're like
Yeah.
working too fast, you're like, no.
That's the park test too, that's really hard to watch, when they just click.
Well, I want to say thank you very much to Dr. Cucci and Dr. Bruni and questions, great information. A lot of the things that I feel I've been able to share with parents, but then also in a different light that you guys have been able to communicate it. So we'll be here for a little bit longer if anybody has additional questions and would like to reach out to any one of us. And then I think it's always best to bridge communication with your schools. So if you're leaving here today and you either have questions that came up from the presentation related to your own circumstances, I would reach out to the people within your building. Starting with if you have an IEP, that case manager. If you don't have an IEP or your child doesn't even have an RTI, I think you would start with the classroom teacher. And then also you can certainly always look for support through the building principal. And then from there, I think those individuals will also help, or they should help, to point you in the other directions, seeking out that information. But I can't say enough about the comment that Dr. Bruni made. Don't let yourself get to the frustration point. You want, and you have the right as a parent to understand how you can best help your child. And at the root of all of this, we want our kids to be successful. And I went into education because of that one principle, and there's not one person or colleague of mine that I've ever worked with that I don't feel that their interest in their principle is that same. So know that at the heart of things, even though sometimes there's disagreements, that we do want what's best. So it's kind of circling back to that original conversation to make sure that you're on the same page and moving in that direction.